Once in khaki suits, ah gee, we looked swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with a drum. Oh, say, don't you remember, they called me Al. It was Al all the time. Say, don't you remember, I'm your pal. Buddy, can you spare a dime?
On the slide that you see in front of you is a photo of 1930s crooner or singer Bing Crosby. He became a popular singer during the 1930s as a result of radio, and he went on to star in Hollywood films in the decades of the 1940s through the 1960s. Crosby was one of the most popular singers of the 20th century. He also sung many of the songs written by Irving Berlin, such as White Christmas, which you heard in a previous lecture, and is singing the now famous Depression-era tune, Brother Can You Spare a Dime? The song was written in 1931 by Yip Harburg and conveys the hardships of Depression-era Americans who had once built the railroads and skyscrapers and fought in World War I, but in the 1930s found themselves unemployed and begging on the streets. The song has since been associated with the era and the Great Depression. Unit 8 is the last lecture of our series about the modernization of America. The Great Depression was a product of the many trends we've been discussing in previous lectures. The mechanization of agriculture and industry produced more goods than Americans could consume and ultimately led to overproduction. Overproduction led to a slowed economy and eventually to job layoffs. The more traditional economic approaches of New Era presidents, who believed in laissez-faire economics and an unregulated marketplace, also contributed to the economic hardships of Americans. By 1932, Americans wanted a president willing to attack the Depression more aggressively. They overwhelmingly elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who redefined the presidency and the role of the federal government. On slide 3, you see an overview of the long-term economic, political, and social consequences of the Great Depression. It's important that you understand how American life was so profoundly affected by this event and how subsequent historical events emerged out of and because of the Great Depression. On the first line, you see some of the economic consequences noted in white. You should follow along on the timeline as I lecture. The stock market crash produced a crisis of capitalism. American faith in an unregulated market declined. By 1935, President FDR turned to Keynesian economics, which I'll discuss later in this lecture, to pump money into the economy and to create jobs. While important for decreasing unemployment, the New Deals did not end the Great Depression. World War II did. It produced nearly full employment. However, as the war approached its end, the federal government worried that returning vets wouldn't be able to find jobs. To temporarily divert them from the workforce, the government passed the GI Bill in 1944. It gave honorably discharged veterans money to go to school and low-interest home loans. The result was eventually a college-educated populace who can now afford their own homes. Both produced tremendous prosperity after 1945 and restored American faith in the American dream. On line 2 in black, you see some of the political consequences of the Great Depression. The inability of Hoover to combat the Great Depression led to an era of the New Era presidents. When FDR won the election of 1932, he launched the New Deals. These programs increased the size and the power of the federal government and of the presidents. They launched an era of the welfare state and the notion that government was responsible for ensuring the well-being or welfare of its citizens. The Great Society programs of LBJ in the 1960s were an outgrowth of these trends. Overseas, unstable economies in Europe produced dictatorships in Spain, Italy, and Germany, and ultimately resulted in the Second World War. After World War II, Allied powers of England, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union divided and occupied Germany, who had launched the Second World War. This division lasted throughout the Cold War until 1990, when the wall fell and Germany was reunited. In pink, you see some of the social consequences of the Great Depression. The Great Depression also continued trends began at the turn of the century. Already by 1900, middle-class families had fewer children and continued to do the same thing in the 1920s when many women delayed marriage and pursued jobs. By the 1930s, fewer families could afford another child. And then during the 1940s, during World War II, young men went overseas to fight. When they returned, they were encouraged by the government and by businesses to have children, and this they did. Between 1946 and 1964, over 76 million children, or baby boomers as we're known, were born. Yes, I'm a baby boomer. The Great Depression and the war that it helped produce created hardships for a generation of Americans not seen since. Yet it also produced a sense of community that united Americans for years to come. On slide 4, you see another version of the material presented on slide 3. It's important, before we discuss the Great Depression, to understand what it was. It was indeed the worst economic crisis the nation has ever experienced. It lasted for 12 years, from 1929 when the market crashed to 1941 when we entered the Second World War. During these years, our GNP, or Gross National Product, a measure of national wealth, declined by 1/3. Unemployment rose to 25%. New Era President Herbert Hoover used trickle-down and laissez-faire economics and promoted Andrew Carnegie's philosophy of self-help to combat the Great Depression. He also supported voluntarism. In other words, that if one had, they should help those who did not. In contrast, FDR pursued Keynesian economics and initiated the New Deals, which altered the size and the power of the federal government. The Great Depression resulted from the slowdown of production and related policies. Because of the mechanization of agriculture and industry, farms and factories produced goods faster and in greater abundance than ever before, and often more than Americans could consume. Hoover assumed that Americans were purchasing more foreign versus American-made products, and that had contributed to the slowdown of production. To make the cost of overseas goods more expensive, and to stimulate domestic economic sales and growth, Hoover imposed protective tariffs on goods being imported by the United States. This adversely affected the U.S. economy, however, as countries abroad imposed counter tariffs that made goods that we exported to them more expensive. Rather than opening up international trade, tariffs closed it. What Hoover's and others failed to understand was how overproduction resulted not from the importation of cheaper foreign goods, but from underconsumption. Many poor Americans, rural farmers, and immigrant laborers in the cities simply didn't have enough surplus income to buy American-made goods, not even automobiles. The market for cars had reached a saturation point by 1928. For example, those who could afford a car had one. Once they did, they didn't need to buy another car. And yet Ford's factories continued to produce the supply, but the demand for automobiles didn't increase. Consequently, even Ford had to lay off workers until consumption resumed. The result of overproduction in agriculture is most evident in the Dust Bowl. It was the worst ecological disaster in U.S. history. It started in 1931 and lasted for a decade when it subsided in 1941. It resulted from many things, including the use of new technology such as the John Deere tractor, which was capable of plowing up land faster and more efficiently than the beasts of burden used by previous farmers. It was also a result of speculation. Suitcase farmers invested in land with the intent of profiting from it. They hired farm families to tend the land until harvest and paid these families a percentage of the profit and pocketed the rest. Using tractors and encouraged by speculators to mass produce, farmers plowed up native grasslands, that held soil down. When drought and record high temperatures hit in 1931, the crops withered and there was nothing to hold down the soil when the winds blew. The hardest hit areas of the Dust Bowl in the Midwest were in eastern Colorado, New Mexico, western Kansas, and in the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, seen on the left-hand side of the slide. A journalist traveling through the area gave the region the name the Dust Bowl, and it stuck. With nothing to hold down the dry soil, the winds picked up and began to carry it for miles. You can see some of these dust storms on the slide on the left and how vast they were. 100 million acres of topsoil blew away. Residents in the Dust Bowl had to shovel out the dust that permeated their homes after a storm. Oftentimes, the dust was piled over a foot or two high in their homes. Gum tape used on windows to keep the dust particles out failed to do so. World War I gas masks were issued to prevent residents from breathing in dust, but many in the Dust Bowl contracted dust pneumonia and died from it. Those who stayed drew water for drinking from deep wells. However, eventually 300,000 migrated from the Dust Bowl to California and Oregon, where they lived in migrant camps and worked in the fields of the San Joaquin Valley. These migrants are known as Okies, a derogatory term that characterizes these individuals as uneducated and low-skilled. These Okies are immortalized by California writer John Steinbeck in his book The Grapes of Wrath. Eventually, a movie starring Henry Fonda by that same name was produced. Woody Guthrie was one of these Okies who migrated from Texas to California, where he worked in radio broadcasting. In Texas, he had experienced the Dust Bowl firsthand. These experiences are captured and conveyed in his Depression-era songs. Guthrie wrote and performed folk music, the genre of music performed by earlier jug bands and that was initially orally performed and not recorded. Country and blues musical traditions also influenced Guthrie's folk music. Folk music is just that, a genre of music rooted in the people, the American life and culture. Folk music conveys the hardships and the concerns of the common working-class American. Poverty and hardship shaped the experiences of Depression-era Americans. The Talking Dust Bowl Blues is one such Woody Guthrie song that conveys the misery of those who lived and labored in the Dust Bowl.
I got that dust pneumonia in my lungs. I got the dust pneumonia in my lungs. And I'm gonna sing this dust pneumonia song.
He also wrote The House of the Rising Sun, We Shall Be Free, and probably a more familiar song, This Land Is Your Land. He later moved to New York City, where he hooked up with another folk songwriter and singer, Pete Seeger. The two influenced a whole generation of folk singers in the 1960s and since. Songwriters such as Bob Dylan and more recently Bruce Springsteen are indebted to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger. The tightening of credit is also a long-term cause of the Great Depression. As agriculture and farmers suffered, so too did industrial laborers in the factories of the Northeast. The slowdown of production led to the tightening of credit. During the 1920s, many Americans used credit to purchase consumer goods and to expand their farms and businesses. As production declined, layoffs in factories increased. Rather than putting surplus income into a savings account, Americans had to withdraw money to survive. Banks began to tighten credit. They gave out fewer loans to farmers and business to expand. And in addition, because of the economic slowdown, many Americans couldn't repay loans they'd taken out previously. Bank deposits dwindled, and some banks were unable to guarantee the deposits of their customers. Fearing that their money wouldn't soon be available when they needed to withdraw it, Americans rushed the banks asking for their money. For some, it was too late. Smart and observant investors who track layoffs and declining credit began to sell off their stocks in the summer of 1929 before it significantly declined in value. However, the biggest sell-off and drop in the market came in October 1929, causing the market to crash. The crash of the stock market signaled the official start of the Great Depression, whose origins could be traced back to the 19th century. On slide 12, you see the visual of the stock market decline, which occurred very dramatically in October of 1929. You also see a visual of paper headlines announcing this crash. Because of the prosperity of the late 19th century and the growth of the U.S. economy in the early 20th century, Americans believed that if one worked hard, they would move up the socioeconomic ladder, that their economic and social status and positions would improve. But by 1929, a lot of Americans were being pushed downward. Males employed in agriculture and industry were the first to experience layoffs and hardships. These men found their identity as the primary provider challenged. We talked about in the Victorian age how increasingly middle-class males were seen as the primary provider. That notion had permeated American society since. Unable to feed their families, these men experienced shame and as a result committed suicides. Many simply abandoned their families. A number of men were forced into what was deemed as women's work or were quickly unemployed. Many found their only meal of the day by standing in soup and bread lines provided by agencies like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. These men found themselves on the street begging for money, on the dole as it was known, taking handouts, but ashamed of doing so. Many were unable to pay rents and lost their place of residence. Instead of living in homes, they traveled across the country and lived in what was called Hoovervilles, or cardboard shacks. Slide 14 shows a graph of the rapid unemployment that occurred starting in 1929. It also shows a picture of some of the bread and the soup lines previously discussed, and an image of the Hoovervilles that many Americans found themselves living in while they endured the Great Depression. Women and families also suffered as a consequence of the Great Depression. Married women who had entered the workforce during World War I found themselves pushed out immediately with the onset of the Great Depression, or they were pressured to leave their jobs. Employers and the public erroneously assumed that the husbands of these women were employed, and that these women should leave the workplace to provide a job for an unemployed male. Single women, employed as pink-collar workers and teachers, stayed employed longer in the industries were less affected by the economic downturn. In a twist of fate, these single women and daughters often became the sole economic providers in the household. This challenged gender roles and family identities, as daughters oftentimes supported parents. Surviving the Great Depression was difficult. On slide 16, you see some of the photographs taken by photojournalist Dorothea Lange, who documented the Great Depression and the poverty and the hardship of American families as they suffered and endured. Blacks and minorities also suffered, and in many respects suffered the most. In the North and West, blacks who labored as porters and in the service industry were immediately laid off. So too were black women. In order to give work to a white person, unemployment was reduced as a consequence of freeing these individuals. Northern racism became more public and apparent during and as a result of the Great Depression. Out west, Mexicans and Mexican Americans were often pushed out of the fields of California with the arrival of the Okies. Many Mexican Americans who were born in the United States and who were U.S. citizens were often legally deported to Mexico. No distinction between legal or illegal was made by the federal government. On reservations, Native American poverty dramatically increased, and Native American life and culture was further undermined. In the South, the lifespans of African American males declined by 10 years as a result of the Great Depression. Sharecropping hadn't worked before the Great Depression, and it certainly didn't during it. Southern blacks also found themselves the target of Jim Crow legislation that we've previously discussed, which made it even more difficult for blacks, and black males in particular, to find jobs at a time of economic hardship. Southern blacks also experienced the rise of the KKK and the violence unleashed by the Great Depression. African American females also faced racism and poverty and struggled to keep their families together. By 1932, nearly every American faced hardship and downward socioeconomic mobility. Faith in the American dream began to dwindle, as did faith in American capitalism. In 1932, they elected a new president who initiated the New Deals and a new era in American politics and government. These are the subjects of the second part of Lecture 8.